Hello, everyone, and welcome to Uncle Bobbie's first Crowdcast virtual author event. My name is Avisa Gallman, and I'm with Uncle Bobbie's Coffee and Books in Germantown, Philadelphia. Well, not physically, but in spirit. I am super excited that we have our author and photojournalist Tish Lampert here today to tell us about her photo book, We Protest, Fighting for What We Believe in. I'd like to start by saying a little bit about the book. It was published this year in March, courtesy of Rizzoli Books. I'm so pumped to have Tish here and to have all of you. I think we're going to have a really great discussion. These are some tough times, and I'm just really happy that we have the opportunity to still come together in the spirit of shared interests, experience, and action. That's really what Tish's book is all about. The book charts the chronology of the social change movements that have dominated the headlines over the past several years, including the fight for women's rights and gender equality, immigration rights, civil liberties, gun violence, the environment, and our voting rights. Tish really takes us to the front lines of activism, where she's captured the spirit of those heroes, as well as, the ordinary people, ordinary citizens on their activist journey to defend the American values during one of the most conflicted times in our recent history. The book was endorsed by Martin Sheen and Harry Belafonte, among others. And we'll be starting shortly, but first I'm going to give a little rundown of what everyone can expect. First, I'm going to show a short video of David K. Shipler's foreword. It's a little bit of a sneak peek at some of the extraordinary photos that you'll see in the book. And then I'll have Tish on, and we're going to talk about the book and about the important work that went into it. After that, we will have a brief audience Q&A. I'll ask you to either submit questions by clicking below on the Ask Question button or by submitting a question to the sidebar where we'll be chatting. Tish's book, We Protest, Fighting for What We Believe in, is available for purchase. If you click on the green Buy We Protest button beneath my screen, it'll connect you to the Uncle Bobbie's online bookstore. So let's get to it. Here's the video forward for We Protest, Fighting for What We Believe in.
The faces of America are in these pages. They are not joyful. Even the occasional thin smile has the sour taste of sorrow. Yet the rage, the stiff determination in the eyes, the lips tight in commitment, the mouths wide in some chant of defiance and hope, all combine in a pageant of inspiration. There are placards, too, with words of anger and pain, deft slogans of stiletto wit and clever contempt. But even without the words, we would have the faces, and the faces tell the story of America. Not an America lost, but an America found again by its great array of women and men who are white, black, and brown, their faces creased with age and unblemished with youth, citizens and immigrants, wounded and secure, comfortable and vulnerable, privileged and pained. They display seasoned values and impatient idealism. They call for rectitude. They demand that we see in them the country's striving for moral justice. The freedom to protest is enshrined in the First Amendment to the Constitution, but its seeds were planted nearly 6 centuries earlier in the Magna Carta, which codified the right of specific nobles to petition the king. That right, later extended by Parliament to every British citizen, became part of a deep heritage of liberty that has nourished the roots of the American idea. The American Revolution was launched not only in opposition to British rule, but also in outrage that the colonies were being denied the rights safeguarded by English law. Rebellion on that count was a backhanded compliment to England, you could say, for not meeting its own standards. The founders then drew from Britain's rich legal traditions, and in key areas, the United States became heir to English common law. The right to demonstrate is one example. It occupies the heart of democracy. Along with freedom of speech, the press, and religion, quote, the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances, unquote, may not be prohibited, the First Amendment declares. That right is inherent, not granted by government. Not all street protests move officialdom, of course, but some have pushed the nation around a corner. The marches of the civil rights movement exposed the ugly cruelty of the segregationists, whose attacks on non-violent demonstrators with fists, fire hoses, and police dogs mobilized the conscience of the country. At the massive 1963 March on Washington, Martin Luther King Jr. stirred the nation. I have a dream. The widening protests against the war in Vietnam helped tip the balance in Washington toward withdrawal. And now we have these images from the election of Donald Trump onward. They flow and merge, moving like a river of distress from grievance to grievance. Will they push us around a corner? We can't say. But savor these images of America the Beautiful. These faces will be a mark of pride when history looks back in judgment on this time.
Okay. Just about ready to bring out our featured author. First, I'm going to tell you a little bit about her. She's a photojournalist. She's based in LA. She began her work in the 70s with a focus on human rights issues. Her work and travels for the United Nations has led her to some truly amazing accomplishments. The United Nations Association honored her for her achievement as a photojournalist in the Sub-Sahara, something that I'm hoping she'll tell us a little bit about more later. Her in-the-field investigations include assignments for the Conflict Awareness Project, the Creative Visions Foundation, Gente Unida, and the Lowland Gorilla Foundation, to name a few. She's exhibited at the UN, in New York, UCLA, Photo LA, and elsewhere. For 5 years, she served as a media director and photographer for Voices of African Mothers, also at the UN. She's also the creator and the host of a really great podcast called America Speaks, which gives voice to today's heroes on the front lines of fighting for social change. Now, everyone, would you please help me in warmly welcoming our featured author, Tish Lampert. Tish, let me get you up here. Bear with me a moment. There we are. Yes. Are we in?
Fabulous.
Hi, Tish.
Thank you so much, Visa. And thank you, Mark, and everyone at Uncle Bobbie's. This is such a delight this evening. And first of all, before I welcome everybody to the discussion this evening, I want to say that the card at the end of the video you just saw should have read, please go to UncleBobbies.com, or is it Uncle Bobbie's Books, Avisa?
Our online store is it's Uncle Bobbie's at IndieLight.com. I'm going to put the link in the comments, but also the link is right down in the buy button below.
That's wonderful. I so appreciate that, because we really want to support Uncle Bobbie's, all of our independent bookstores at this time, and welcome all of you this afternoon in Los Angeles. I am so delighted that we can all come together to discuss We Protest, fighting for what we believe in. First, I want to say, these are times like no other, no question. And I think for an author with a book that comes out right when a pandemic occurs, as we have experienced, I was so disappointed not to be able to go on a book tour. But this tiny, small silver lining for all of us this evening is I get to see friends from all over the country and people who may not have been able to join me in conversation about the book. So for everyone who's in Boston or Hudson, New York, or Philadelphia, or Los Angeles, San Francisco, everywhere, welcome. And so let me just ask for a proverbial show of hands, because if you have protested for anything in the past 4 years, you actually could very well find yourself in one of the photographs in my book. So let me just imagine that you're all raising your hands, but at the very least, let me say, your spirit is in my book, We Protest. You know, people have asked me why this book and why now. I think Lisa and I were talking about that.
Yeah.
And I think to give a greater context to how first of all, how I chose and why I chose to do this book, it's important to know that We Protest is the culmination of 2 decades on the trail, photographing, documenting, and witnessing the rise of social justice movements and our activism since the dawn of the 21st century. So to understand that, I think we go back to the disputed election of George Bush and how our vote collided with the Supreme Court. Then it's important to get a sense of what was inspiring me and why I felt this was something to photograph with such seriousness. And I began to see, with the invasion of Iraq and the many years of protests, I saw story after story of veterans families, activists, every range that I can think of, out there on the street protesting. And there's no question that our demands and our cries were falling on deaf ears in Washington. And what intrigued me was, how was this story being told? So this evening, as we look at my book, which is the culmination of this anthem, this anthology that I have chronicled, We Protest, my publisher Rizzoli and my editor Martinka Wozniak and myself just really thought that we would take a detailed examination of the disruption, the wave of activism with the resistance, the frustrations, and the triumphs since Donald Trump was elected president. And, there's no question that in 4 years, actually, which is just amazing to me because I have been out there documenting this, there has been so much material to include. When I think of what we didn't have room to include, it's baffling that in 4 years, so many crises, so much opposition. I think of how we defend our rights. And to me, the one thing that is so obvious is the harder we have fought to protect our rights, the more vulnerable our freedoms have become. So I also want to say what was very important to me is that I think I wasn't interested in just presenting one crowd shot after the other or one range of protest pictures. I was looking for a way to strike a chord with not only the separate chapters and issues, but the individuals, the amazing Americans that I have met along the way, who have nourished the book with their commentary and their statements, their passions, their frustrations, their courage, And so we'll get a chance in a moment to read some of these statements. And I was just blessed because also the diversity and the range of ages, people who impacted my book, have been truly extraordinary. And I know that this will inspire you, and it will also inspire you to want to get a copy, because my book is a narrative storybook. And it's hard to think of protests like that because people tend to look at it in a more static, square perspective. But that's not how we protest moves. It's definitely, think of it with a way to breathe, because the story does have a 3-act structure or 4-act structure, which you'll see when you pick up your copy. So the other thing I want to mention this evening is what happens to me on the trail. And there's no question that I come alive when I am on the street. And I write in the protest when I see a crowd amassing with placards waving, when I hear the sound of feet pounding the pavement, voices rising over each other, I feel an uncontrollable urge to be among them, to follow the momentum and capture the spirit that compels people to rise up. The adrenaline is addictive for me, and it's been in my blood since I first picked up my Nikon FTN camera. And I'm actually frustrated. I was going to bring my camera this evening, but just envision a 1967 old Nikon black and white camera that has stayed by my side for 46 years. And to me, I was just so enthralled by finding my niche with narrative photography. And I was able to, throughout my career, very early on, have an opportunity to tell stories of the triumph of the human spirit. And what has really motivated my work throughout the years is been to really capture a way to go deeper into a story that can inform us better on how we overcome injustice. So I like to say that the seeds in many cultures throughout my work and my lifetime have informed my work, from my work in Guatemala for a brief time, to the Democratic Republic of Congo, to Burundi, Rwanda, Ghana. I worked for 10 years with the Navajo Nation. And also, there's no question, crisscrossing the United States for 2 decades. And this evening, I would like to begin, Elisa said that I had worked as media director of Voices of African Mothers. I also work with the Conflict Awareness Project, Kathy Austin. There's a story I'd like to tell of something that happened in Rwanda that truly is a way that will explain how, something happens to you when you have the opportunity to record history, and you may be the only person or the only witness capturing that image. And I have had that opportunity a number of times where there's no one else, or perhaps you're responsible as the messenger for taking that moment and portraying this history. And this happened to us in Rwanda when we were detained in 2006 I was taking a photograph of Kathy, who had taken me up to the area where the children had been killed during the genocide. And it was a very bleak building. It was a beautiful environment, but the building was very simple and rustic, just cinder block and rebar crosses. Kathy was kneeling, paying her respects, and I'm outside photographing. And suddenly I feel a hand under my shoulder, escorting me away. It was a group of police, telling me, what was I doing? In French, they were saying, what was I doing with these pictures? They were taking me into the station. because we were with the UN, we were able to follow them. But to cut to the chase, what happened after a very, nerve-wracking conversation with the chief of police? He had my camera and he looked me directly in the eye and he said, "What are you intending to do with these photographs?" And he admitted that they were ashamed, deeply ashamed of what had happened there. And that my photograph was going to represent the commemoration of these children, and that they were embarrassed by the building. And he felt very strongly that I was careful how I portrayed this in history. And, one of the things that we don't always admit is we have to ask ourselves as photojournalists, have you told the story truthfully? And it occurred to me, this wasn't whether I could be truthful or dishonest with the photograph, but it was important that I honored his request, because I realized I was one of the only people taking these images back to the United States. And this moment has informed my approach to how I have created We Protest. And I say this because I began the project at the inauguration of Donald Trump. And I'm going to be completely candid here. From the onset, I arrived with trying to find some impartial perspective, to be somewhat removed, to document, not be involved. But I honestly, that went out the window for me. The minute we were all of us on the parade route, there wasn't a dry eye on the parade route. I think the reaction to the hundreds and hundreds of people who were there with me was a reflection of perhaps almost a premonition of what was to come. And I think every socioeconomic group, every justice group, every group imaginable was there in some fashion. And I thought to myself that day, how are we going to document this? I didn't know I was going to do the book at that time. And I think that when we do look at the way we portray history, I'm putting my thumbprint on it with We Protest. And I also look at this book, besides being your protest handbook, which we'll go over, in a bit, but it is a keepsake of us having struggled, us having persevered, and us having organized. And I just want to get a sense of what does it mean when you're trying to motivate people to rethink activism? And this is what I have done with We Protest. And I do have to say that it is because I have had such an extraordinary collaboration with so many people across the country who have nourished the book with their statements that we have been able to really individuate how we have told the story in the past 4 years. So I think it's important, before I continue and dive a bit into the book, because I am in Philadelphia this evening, to talk about one of my heroes. And I say this because, not only am I reminded on how I have to truthfully tell a story, but I got a swift kick in the butt from having met this incredible 94-year-old woman, Vivian Applewhite, in Philadelphia in 2012. And she is like what I would consider a true role model. She is the activist's activist. And I want to just say to you, if you don't know who Vivian Applewhite is, it's through her that Pennsylvania was able to put Obama over the top and win the vote in Pennsylvania for his reelection bid in 2012. And she could be considered one of the reasons why he won. And her story is remarkable. So just a real hats off to Viviette for a minute. I was with my dear friend Irene Lane, and she had said to me, take her car. I was journeying to Viviette's convalescent home in South Philly, and I got very lost. And Viviette, I didn't really know that much about her, but she proceeded to explain. But it's very important to know that I was late. And I called Viviette on the phone and I said, Viviette, I'm running late. I'm so sorry. And she said to me, dear, you better hurry up here. I have the ambulance downstairs. I'm having a heart attack. But I'm not going anywhere because I don't want to miss you taking my picture. And I said, Viviette, my God, should we not do this another time? Or, I can stay in Philadelphia longer. And she said, absolutely not. This is very important. I put my life, my faith, and my activism on the line for my fight. And here's Viviette's story. So she was robbed in the market. All of her identification was taken. She was unable to get her voter registration card back. She had registered and voted at the same precinct for 50 years. And Viviette was denied her right to register and vote because there was such discrimination at that time in Pennsylvania and so much gerrymandering, and Viviette would not hear of it. And she persisted. She was loud, she was obstinate, she didn't take no for an answer, and her case became very clear and obvious to voting rights groups, and then the ACLU took it up, and Viviette's case went all the way to the Supreme Court in Pennsylvania, and she won. And it was through her efforts that registration was reopened, and there were many people in her circumstance. And so just to give you a greater sense of Viviette, I want to read what she said to me that isn't in this book, but this is really something we should all be thinking of today. If there's any question whatsoever that you may not find the impetus to vote, Viviette wrote to me, people built our nation. Our republic is in the hands of the people. A word of caution to politicians. You better take us seriously, because if you don't believe in us, if you don't believe in the power of the people, you will lose your jobs. I have lived in this country for almost 100 years, and I've seen what it takes to get the politicians to make laws that actually help the citizens. I learned that marching with Martin Luther King. We must remind ourselves every single day to fight for our rights. If we don't back down, if we continue to stand up for our rights, then and only then do I have all the faith in the world for our democracy. And so with that, I want to segue a little bit about We Protest. And I think what's important is, so to be able to get a context of how we divided the book, it was divided just by broad subject, something that could seem a little static, a little antiseptic, but it is the nourishment, it's the flavor, it's the extraordinary passion of the statements that are in the book that I really feel give us a true context of what really makes the book a keepsake. And I have to say that I'm only going to read a few of these because we may have questions. I don't want to go too long this evening. But the women I met at the protest of Kavanaugh for the time that I was there, truly, I don't think there can be enough said about those that came across the country from coast to coast, from Alaska, from Hawaii, to tell their honest story of abuse and persecution and everything they were feeling, the gambit. I don't think I have felt, other than, well, there have been several times with this project that I have had to put aside my hat as a photographer and be a woman or a mother or a daughter, or a grandmother. But let me read what Rosemary Gessen said to me, standing in front of the Supreme Court. And when you get the book and you find this, I think you'll find the entire chapter is just alive with true passion, honesty. It's real. It will strike a chord in you, I promise. Rosemary writes, I protested Kavanaugh because as I heard more and more women tell their stories, I realized that the pain I carry as a survivor of sexual violence did not always need to be a source of isolation and shame. I realized I could transform my pain into solidarity, into love, and political power. So I raised my voice for justice. Thank you, Rosemary, wherever you are, because truthfully, your courage to release that really meant a great deal to me, to my editor, and all of us working on the book. So now I want to just move ahead to give context of another chapter. And I want to talk about Javier, who I have known on the trail, an extraordinary young man who writes this in the immigration chapter. Javier shares with us that he is a DACA recipient and an immigrant. I kept this to myself for many years. Whenever I faced discrimination, I felt powerless and alone. But today, I no longer am silent about the horrible things that are happening to the families in my community. For the longest time, I felt like my voice didn't matter. But now, I think differently. We can't be frightened any longer. Real courage comes from acting despite being afraid and standing up for those who cannot speak for themselves. And I want to thank you, Javier, because truthfully, that helped to inform how we were going to portray the entire chapter on immigration. Now I want to turn to the Black Lives Matter chapter, to the chapter on civil rights, which is a chapter I want to discuss a little bit this evening because it was important to me to thread back before the Trump years because I felt very strongly about including the injustice that had happened for so many families with police brutality and with gun violence. And having covered this pretty extensively, I insisted we include some of this in the book. And so when you do get a copy of the book, I think you'll be very interested in looking at that portrayal. And, you know, let's not kid ourselves. We all know this is happening daily. But what's important and mindful is that our activism is critical for holding this injustice accountable. So Oscar Batista writes, racism is a plague that this country holds on to dearly. From my brown complexion to my outspokenness, I've walked in life with this target on my back. From this I know to protect myself from anyone who means to do me harm. That alertness has never left me. And now I believe it is a tool that helps me wear that target without fear, a tool to encourage others to do the same. I believe if we do not voice our frustrations towards injustice, if we do not stand tall against tyranny, we will fall. We will fall hard. In this stain of a presidency, we have a duty to protect each other for that reason. Watch each other closely, raise each other up high, and call out the acts of violence, because silence is not an option. And before I turn this back to Avisa, I want to just say that, I've had the privilege of knowing Martin Sheen while I have created this book. And this goes back to what we are saying about how we are trying to defend our freedoms. I think, we are exhausted defending our freedoms. There's no question about that. In every manner possible before the pandemic. I think we are confused on how our activism is going to look coming up, but make no mistake of it. We are powerful, and our transformational power of our voices is like nothing else. And we saw that in 2018. But I want to read this because this is in the book, in my book, at the end of my book, and I think this will really strike a chord with you. When I interviewed Martin Sheen on my podcast, this is what he told me. We came out of the 60s with the sober realization that if you believe in anything of value, it's going to cost you something, or you are left to question its value. And it has to be a personal fight, because if it is not a personal fight, then it is impersonal. And if it is impersonal, who the hell cares? And I say this because after 20 years, I've had the privilege of sharing your personal fight, of sharing your passion out there on the trail. You know, We Protest is a raw examination of today's resistance, but it's also a terrific, I guess you could say, it is a calling card of your bravery, your courage, and your efforts to not throw away the gains that we have gotten with what has happened to create not only a protection of our freedoms, but we've seen very closely and carefully that all of this is very fragile if you sit on the sidelines. So with that, I want to say thank you so much, and I'd love to answer any questions.
Yeah. That's not disturbing. And if there's a question, can type it into the sidebar. I want to actually start with just, I'd like to ask, how does a book like this, like a book of photographs, how do you think it will resonate with the public of different eras, over time?
That's such a good question because, I think in compiling it, that was important to me, that we didn't go at it with this sort of trend perspective. So I think for me, I look at this book as a way for, it's a cautionary tale of a sort. But when you think of how we define an era, I think you'll find that there are things that are captured within the full narrative of the book that will be what is setting the tone for how we view activism. So the way to explain that perhaps is to go back and let's look at the Women's March. I don't think we had ever seen 1 million women, not only in Washington, but across the country. What did that eruption mean to you personally? What did it mean to the era? When our children and grandchildren pick up this book, I honestly can promise you they'll feel that from going through the pages and reading the statements. Also, what I think is important is that it also really portrays, in one sense, the issues that have been the most important to bring out the protests, the opposition and the resistance. But the book has a true narrative that is a directive, and it ends with the fight for our environment. And, the one real truth of what we're experiencing now with the pandemic is that we're so absorbed in survival that, we're looking at survival in all areas. So one of the beauties of the book right now is it does fill you up with a sense of promise. In the section on the environment, I think you'll find it very uplifting with what's being done. And it has a tremendous impact with all the youth activists. A lot of them I have met on my journey. I don't know if that answers the question.
Yeah, that's great. I actually want to go back to what you said before. Were telling us about the person who asked of you that you tell the story truthfully.
Mm-hmm.
What truths do you think you were able to portray about, some of the more recent protests on American soil? What about our country?
That's a very good point, because I think sometimes you think of the truth having to have two perspectives. Are we on both sides of the aisle or the street with this? I think, to me, the truth is, the way I look at it, it's like it's a moment that teaches you something. It's a teachable moment. It's a moment that changes how you would have thought about it otherwise. I think what stayed with me about the Rwanda story was it never even crossed my mind how I was depicting this. Should I have taken the photograph, per se, with a larger expanse of background of how beautiful the area was with the building small, as opposed to just the small building? So when your lens is bracketing something, you're creating that moment. And time after time, and I can think of all the emotional aspects of the subjects that we covered, from either the Trump inauguration, which really, to me, was a choice, and the publisher's choice, of really depicting the emotion. So it's a very tearful chapter. Whereas with the immigration chapter, it's more of an angry or a defiant chapter. So that truth comes in that emotion. So maybe to answer your question a little clearer is, I think the truth has to align with the emotion that you're feeling. And you can't manufacture that.
Wow. What a wide range of emotions that can be captured.
We are through it, absolutely. Yeah, and hopefully all of you have questions.
Yeah, we have one question here from Irene Lane, that is there one photo whose story continues to haunt you or inspire you, and why?
Oh, that's such a good question, Irene. Well, I have to go back. There's many, so I think perhaps I have to say, is there one issue that I look back on and I think to myself, God, I just can't get over it. And so I'm going to have to say it was when we put Judge Kavanaugh on the Supreme Court. And I have a series of photos that describe that. But again, it's tearful, but it's every woman's reaction, the look in their eyes. To this day, I still have countless pictures we couldn't include. And I remember when I was working with Jan Wilhelm Dickers, my designer, him constantly asking me, should we have this one or this one? And I would say, we need both of them. Because to me, it was like, where are these images of how our country was responding to literally putting this individual onto the Supreme Court for a lifetime? What it did do was it brought forth to me the responsibility of all the issues I was worried that he could in fact impact, like our rights as women, or gun control, or what everybody, is truly worried about is our right to vote. So I have to say that I think that protest still haunts me to this day, for sure. The Kavanaugh protest.
Haunting indeed. Let me see. Another question we have here from Richard Colton. Before you picked up a camera and directed it at the human condition, can you tell us something about your path that led you there? before you, yeah, that led you to pick up the camera?
You know, that's a great question. And I have to be honest with you, it always changes when I get there. So I get myself all primed and ready, and I think I'm going to have this point of view, and then something will happen that will turn me around. I think, you know, I want to go back to the civil rights chapter and broadly talk about what was happening that day, because I honestly, again, was not prepared for my response to it. And this actually, it brings into the context of, am I exploiting someone's suffering? You know, we have to ask ourselves this question today, and you'll see it in the book, because we have been suffering through so many issues. So Richard, what I have to say is during the protest in Washington, that really was a memorial of sorts for Tamir Rice with Al Sharpton and his NAN project, his NAN organization. All of the parents who were more high profile, who had lost children to police violence, came and were speaking. And it was very cold. So you're asking, was I prepared? So I just want to impart this story because I want you to all go to that chapter and you'll get a sense of what I'm talking about. So I was in the front with the press passes. It was freezing, and I could not take my eyes off of Tamir Rice's mother, who could barely stand up. And I get a little emotional just even thinking about this moment, actually. So Trayvon Martin's mother was holding her up, and I believe also Al Sharpton was holding her up, literally under her arms. And there were other people talking, and my mind was spinning. I honestly could not pick up the camera and photograph this because it was back to that experience. Am I exploiting her suffering? But the photograph would have been amazing, and I couldn't take it because she was in so much pain, and I was with her in that pain. We all were. So the photograph I took in response to that moment that I wasn't prepared for is in the book, and it's of the crowd praying. And if you go to the chapter, you'll see it. And I think in one sense, you'll see all these people holding hands with their eyes shut, almost in commemoration of that suffering.
That's such a powerful, powerful image. I think, yeah, what part of what Richard was asking was just about before you, what led you to like pick up that camera before, before all of the accomplishments and before the book, but just on your journey, what about the human condition was the catalyst that started you, sparked you to pick up that camera and begin this journey?
That's such a good question because, in my last talk, I talked about my past. So one of the things I think that a photojournalist who does broad range projects like me, like narrative photography, where you're developing a story, it's not necessarily the commercial route, but I think for me, it's been the important route because I wanted to leave my imprint on something. So Richard, actually, this is a crazy thing, but it's a series of two things. So I actually was photographing rock and roll, and I was photographing, I was in England, I was an actor, I was trying to stay in England, and I had to get a job to get through the home office requirement. And so I got a job freelancing on the Evening Standard, and the first time they sent me out, I was photographing the Royal College of Acupuncture's very first graduating class in Kenilworth, England. And on the road to Kenilworth, I was driving for the first time. on the left side of the road. I was 19 or 20 at the time, and I had the camera and a big rover. I had no idea what I was doing, and I couldn't drive well, so I was stopping frequently, and I kept stopping on this roadway, and one family after another was experiencing displacement. They were being forced into dole housing in England and London because they were building the M1 and the M4. And I thought, my God, is anybody telling this story? And that is when, I have to say, I started cataloging this, having no idea what I was doing. So I hope that answers your question, but I do have to say that it propelled me then to go up to Wales to do the same thing as mines were closing and people lost their jobs. So here I am, this American chickie, 20 years old, no idea what I'm doing, you know, also up in Wales, trying to put myself in a little thing through the mines. I couldn't handle it. But instead of doing that, what I did find is I would go to the pub and I would sit down next to an old guy who said to me his son was out of work, his wife was out of work, and again, I would take his picture. So I feel that that is the catalyst that said to me, hey, Tish, you know what? You've got to photograph the triumph of the human spirit, and that's what started it.
Wow. I think that's just about all the time we have.
Well,
Tish, thank you so much. Thank you also to all of our participants. Thanks to for the forward, David K. Shipler, and the associates at Rizzoli Books. The book is available now for purchase. Just click that buy button right in the bottom. Another way that you could help support our independent bookstore during these tumultuous times is to visit our GoFundMe, and that's gofundme.com/we still here. And make a small donation. It really mean a lot to Uncle Bobbie's. Yeah. Thank
I
you
just
so much.
want to say to everybody, please support Uncle Bobbie's. Buy a copy of my book, and I promise you, I will find a way to sign it.
Yeah,
that's
one
a
of
promise.
That we can.
I may not fly in the plane there, and may drive, but that's even better.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Tish. This was great.
Thank you all, and thank you so much for coming. This has been great.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good night.
Bye.
Bye.